Thank you for inviting me to speak to you. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about Mass Timber and what we do at the Mass Timber Institute. Um, so, so just to give you a brief introduction about myself, I graduated recently with a Master of Forest Conservation program at U of T. Before that, I did my undergrad in biochemistry, and currently I am a research project coordinator working with the Mass Timber Institute. So let's get right into mass timber. What is it? You might have heard of mass timber before, but might not exactly know what it is. Essentially, it's an engineered wood product that is often used for construction. Mass timber is created by either gluing or nailing small pieces of wood together to form larger beams that are able to be used in structural and load-bearing applications like beams, panels, and walls. So an example of this can be seen in this photo, along with other photos that I'll be showing throughout the presentation. One commercial example project is this flagship Shoppers Drug Mart store that's located just south of Yonge and Bloor. And this was created by Timber Systems, mostly built out of CLT, which is an acronym for cross-laminated timber. Mass timber comes in many forms. As I mentioned, the first form here on the top left is cross-laminated timber, which is formed by adhering the, the boards in perpendicular directions and layering them on top of each other so that you have a very robust kind of mass beam that can withstand stresses in all directions. Other application, and this is the most common one that's used in building. Other applications are mass plywood panels, dowel laminated timber, which is fastened using dowels, nail laminated timber, which is fastened using nails, glue laminated timber, which is also popular, and others. So it comes in a lot of different forms, and there's also facilities that specialize in fabricating these various forms. Inherently, mass timber has many benefits, especially when we're comparing to building with concrete or steel. Firstly, because it's sourced from trees, obviously, using mass timber locks in carbon that has been sequestered from our atmosphere. As a result, depending on how the wood supply for mass timber is acquired, it can be a sustainable and renewable material. There seems to be also a renewed interest by architects and the public about the aesthetics of wood building and building with wood. So studies have shown that living in buildings and working in buildings made with mass timber with exposed faces tends to lower stress levels and also contributes to an overall increase in well-being. They've also had potential to weigh less than conventional buildings, sometimes even half as much. And importantly to Canada, Indigenous communities who have rights to resources might have an opportunity to get involved in the mass timber sector through collaboration and sharing of knowledge and utilization of these resources. Mass timber panels and also smaller structures can be built in a modular fashion away from construction sites, which can reduce labor costs and time on site by simplifying the building process. They also are inherently exceptionally fire resistant. So this picture shows the char that forms on the right beam that forms on the outside of mass timber columns, which actually protects the mass timber from getting destroyed during a fire. So it's often kind of a misconception that mass timber is not fire resistant at all, but actually it's the complete opposite. That's the case. So usually, actually, mass timber either meets at least, but often exceeds fire codes, and it often performs better than steel or concrete in fires. So I mentioned before the case about modular construction about mass timber. Here's an example of a modular mass timber construction that was completed by Element 5, which is a mass timber manufacturing company located in Ontario. This was done in collaboration with Edge Architects, and they put together this modular four-story building that provides affordable housing in just 20 days. So this construction was done in 20 days, not including the facades or the interior, but the superstructure was done in 20 days. And this was done for the YWCA in Kitchener, Ontario. There's also many other examples of modular construction using mass timber that's been done in Canada and internationally. And I can share some other resources about the time lapse of this and other buildings if you'd like after the presentation. Mass timber is not just limited to buildings. While it can also be used to build tall and mid-story and low-rise buildings, it's also been used and can be used in infrastructure construction like buildings, like this photo here. So in terms of producing mass timber, Element 5, as I mentioned very briefly previously, has built the only CLT manufacturing plant in Ontario. This is located in St. Thomas, and it was opened in 2021 with wood supply coming from White River, which is about 1,000 kilometers away in northwestern Ontario, just north of Lake Superior. So MTI is actually working with Element 5 currently to investigate the feasibility of sourcing lumber from private plantations in southern Ontario, which are much closer than White River, which is 1,000 kilometers away again, to construct mass timber and ultimately be used in the Greater Toronto Area for development. If this timber is closer to Element 5, it will greatly decrease the greenhouse gas emissions attributed to transporting wood, as well as supporting local economies. So this brings us to the Mass Timber Institute. Mass Timber Institute is a multidisciplinary player in the field of construction in Canada. It was launched in 2018 by Dr. Ann Coven in partnership with Robert Wright, who is the previous dean of Daniels, with seed funding from the Ministry of Natural Resources. Our leadership chair is Craig Applegath, who is the principal of the Architectural Forum Dialogue, and he's also a leading voice in innovation in architecture and conservation. The Institute is relatively new, and it is now a unit, as I heard in the introduction, a unit with the Daniels Faculty of Landscape Architecture and Design at U of T. So since its creation back in 2018, it has grown to build a solid foundation of partners, industries, and communities to support its mission. At the moment, the Institute operates through the lens of ever-increasing population growth and resulting pressure to develop sustainably in our urban centers. So the key objective of the Mass Timber Institute is to contribute research and education to the slowly emerging mass timber sector in Canada. So if we dive a bit deeper into looking at mass timber in Canada, building with mass timber has been gaining traction in the recent past decades. As you can see in this graph taken from NRCan, it's slow but still emerging. However, it's still very low, the levels of projects completed when compared to the number of conventional buildings that is using concrete and steel built per year. Compared with the large number of buildings in Canada and the USA, the number of mass timber buildings is still very, very low. If we break this down a bit further, looking at every province, here in this graph also by NRCan, as we can see, there's an increase in the number of mass timber projects in Canada as time goes on, with BC, which is the light blue bars, and Quebec, which is dark green, being leaders overall. In Ontario, the light green bars, the number of projects has seen an increase since 2012, but it's still pretty low. So most importantly, the biggest construction industry in Canada is in the Greater Toronto Area, and we are still using very little mass timber. Huge developments are still being made in the downtown core, for example, and surrounding areas that don't take advantage of mass timber yet. One reason for more mass timber utilization in BC and Quebec is because those two provinces actually have a wood first building policy. So this means that all new buildings must demonstrate why they cannot be made of wood prior to conventional construction, and public buildings must be made with wood first of all. So you might ask, why don't we have this type of thing in Canada? In Ontario rather. And this is because the forest sector plays a much smaller role in Ontario when compared with Quebec and BC. So the governments are more supportive of these forest industries in those two provinces. This map shows the current projects that have been completed as of 2021 in Ontario and Quebec. Collectively, Ontario and Quebec account for around just 200 of the mass timber projects in Canada. And when we add British Columbia to the mix, that moves up to about 450 projects. So in just 2019, Quebec completed 25 mass timber structures. In 2017, according to the NRCan statistics, there's been just 11 mass timber projects completed. And overall, there had only been just over 30 projects that have been built in Ontario up till now. So essentially, this is to show that there are very few mass timber projects in Canada, in Ontario that much, in Ontario, and we are in Ontario much farther behind from BC and Quebec. It's interesting though, even if we put this into context with the United States, it can be noted that there's roughly a similar number of mass timber projects that have been completed compared to Canada. So according to the International Mass Timber Report in 2021, there were roughly 460 buildings that have been built or are currently being built in the United States since 2013. And this number is slowly increasing, as you can see by this graph here, and is forecasted to be just over 1,000 in the short coming future. So while the current development with mass timber is low, we believe that once the United States starts ramping up production, they might surpass Canada, but there's currently no data to predict the future growth yet. It's also important to note that the current demand for mass timber in the United States accounts for just 2% of the national softwood timber production. So moving back to Canada, sorry, here are a couple of examples of what has been done with mass timber and reasons to look toward the future for more mass timber development. The first here is 80 Atlantic Avenue, which is located in Liberty Village. It's a 6-story commercial office building housing high-tech offices, and it won the 2019 Wood Design and Build Award. It's a good practical example of how mass timber can be used for commercial applications. This Galleria Italia is a more iconic application of mass timber located in Toronto. It was constructed out of Douglas fir from BC and really serves as a showcase to show what mass timber can accomplish architecturally. There are also some plans to create more buildings in Southern Ontario, like the new building at George Brown College, Limberlost Place. And of course, 150 Devonshire is another building that will be built at UT. So this is a 14-story building that will be a mass timber and concrete hybrid structure, the tallest of its kind in North America. That might not be right actually at this moment. But this new development and the George Brown College development serve as prime examples to showcase mass timber to the public and put it in the spotlight to show what building with mass timber can achieve. So, as I mentioned, there are clearly many benefits to mass timber. As we transition toward a more sustainable, low carbon economy, and as building codes follow suit, we may see an increasing demand for mass timber. However, since the raw material is sourced from our forests, the question of scale that this demand will have on sustainability and management of our forests needs to be raised. As we increase demand, more pressure will be put on our forests. So as we can see here in this very complicated slide, you don't have to worry about everything on there. It's just to illustrate that there are many steps involved in the construction of mass timber, from the design of the concept to sourcing of raw materials, processing, transport, and assembly. Each process has its own carbon footprint, but the overall goal with mass timber is to ensure that each step is done in the most efficient and sustainable way, if we wish to keep sustainability in mind, of course. And scale and source is also very important. So this is actually something that we are working on at the Mass Timber Institute in collaboration with Kelly Doran, who is a professor with Daniels. He runs the HAP Studio, which is looking to decrease the carbon emissions created by building a building in half, essentially. So this is just a slide that kind of shows, everything that goes into these life cycle assessments to study how much carbon actually goes into building a building and how complex it is. So that previous slide that I just showed is actually a figure from this project and another project that we're working on at the or that we've actually completed at the Mass Timber Institute in collaboration with the Canadian Wood Council, which is something you should all take a look at actually, because it's a fantastic resource outlining how wood can be used to construct buildings in Canada and how sustainable it is, as well as how we ensure that we are managing our forests appropriately to ensure this wood is sustainable. So this is actually made for you guys to better understand how we're using wood and how we're sourcing it. Sorry. We're also starting a podcast. So we're currently working on this right now. And it's geared to engaging in conversations between engineers, architects, and builders. and foresters to close the knowledge gap and stimulate dialogue between these disciplines. And this is really to ensure that all these disciplines are working synergistically to achieve the goal of a more sustainable developmental future. Just two more slides. One last project we're working on is to help fund a project by Ross Wood. He's an architecture student at U of T, and he's also working with Ted Kessick, who is a professor of building science, to map historical tall wood structures in Toronto. We have a lot of tall wood structures that were made decades ago, even maybe a century ago, that use mass timber kind of principles. So this project really builds an inventory of what we have in the city to determine how to use these spaces most effectively. Good time to get out. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please let me know.